Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Ruth and Victor had been through many trials together, each hardship strengthening their bond. Their love had always been resilient, surviving the financial setbacks and emotional turbulence that came with years of trying to build a future from almost nothing. Victor, an ambitious man with dreams far larger than their current circumstances, constantly sought opportunities to improve their lives. Ruth, ever the pragmatist, supported him but often reminded him to tread carefully. She had seen people lose everything in pursuit of risky ventures, and she didn't want that to be their story. It was a late evening when Victor came home with a spark in his eyes, a spark Ruth hadn't seen in a long time. He dropped his bag by the door and hurried into the living room where Ruth was folding laundry. His excitement was almost contagious, but Ruth remained calm, watching him with curiosity. "I've got something that could change everything for us," Victor said breathlessly. Ruth raised an eyebrow, folding the last towel with deliberate care. "Change everything how?" she asked, skeptical but intrigued. Victor took a deep breath and began explaining. He had met with an old friend, Mike, who had recently returned from overseas. Mike had a business idea, a project involving import and distribution, but he needed reliable partners to invest and help manage operations locally. According to Victor, the market was ripe for this opportunity, and early investors stood to make significant profits within a few years. Ruth listened patiently as Victor outlined the plan in detail. He spoke about the growing demand for imported goods in the region, the potential for quick returns, and the trust he had in Mike. It all sounded promising, but something nagged at Ruth's mind. "Victor," she said, her tone cautious, "I know you trust Mike, but this still sounds risky. What if something goes wrong? We can't afford to lose what little we have left." Victor sighed and sat beside her on the couch, taking her hands in his. "I know it's a risk, Ruth, but think about what this could mean for us. No more worrying about rent. No more scraping by every month. We could finally have the life we've dreamed of. I believe in this, and I need you to believe in me too." Ruth stared into his eyes, seeing both hope and desperation. She knew how much Victor hated their current situation, hated feeling trapped in a cycle of poverty despite all their efforts. And deep down, she wanted to believe in him. He had always been a man of dreams, and though not all of them had worked out, he never stopped trying. "I'm not against us taking a chance," Ruth finally said. "But if we do this, we have to go all in with a clear plan. No shortcuts, no hasty decisions." Victor nodded eagerly. "Agreed. We'll do everything by the book. We'll consult experts, review contracts, and make sure we're prepared for any setbacks. This time we'll succeed." They spent the next few days discussing the investment, going over every detail and potential risk. Ruth suggested they meet with Mike to assess his seriousness and reliability. Victor arranged a meeting, and the couple found Mike to be confident and knowledgeable, with a clear vision for the business. Though Ruth still had reservations, she saw the potential and decided to trust Victor's instincts. The decision to invest marked a turning point in their lives. They scraped together every penny they could find, selling off old belongings and borrowing from a few trusted friends. It wasn't easy, but they were determined. For the first time in years, they dared to hope for something better. That night, after finalizing the investment, Ruth and Victor sat quietly on their small balcony, watching the stars. Victor held her hand, a rare moment of peace settling between them. "Do you ever wonder if this is how success stories begin?" Victor asked softly. Ruth smiled faintly. "Maybe. I just hope ours doesn't end in tragedy." "It won't," Victor promised, squeezing her hand. "We'll make it through. Together." Together they dared to dream, but neither of them knew that their greatest challenge lay just beyond the horizon. Victor and Ruth stepped into the business world cautiously, their excitement tempered by the realities of what was at stake. The money they had invested represented years of sacrifice, but Victor remained optimistic. He was determined to make this venture a success. Ruth, though supportive, kept her guard up. She had seen enough failures in her life to know that ambition without strategy could destroy even the strongest bonds. Their initial weeks were full of challenges. They quickly realized that starting a business was not as straightforward as Victor had believed. Suppliers delayed shipments, prospective clients hesitated to commit, and the financial burden mounted faster than either of them had expected. Victor spent long hours trying to solve problems, meeting with vendors and potential investors, while Ruth handled much of the administrative work. She spent late nights balancing their books, hoping they could keep things afloat for just a little longer. Stress seeped into their relationship. They argued more frequently, often about the same issues, money, risks, and trust. One evening after a particularly difficult day, Ruth confronted Victor as he entered their small office. "We can't keep going like this," she said, frustration tightening her voice. "We're bleeding money, and I don't see a plan for how we're going to fix it." Victor sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. He was exhausted, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. "I'm working on it, Ruth. I've got a few deals in progress. Once those come through, we'll be fine." "You've been saying that for weeks. What if those deals fall apart? What's our backup plan?" "We don't have a backup plan," he snapped, his tone harsher than intended. "We put everything into this. If you can't believe in me, then maybe—" "Don't you dare," Ruth interrupted, her eyes flashing with anger. "I'm here because I believe in us. But believing in something doesn't mean ignoring reality. We need to be smarter about this." The tension hung between them like a heavy cloud, neither willing to back down. Finally, Victor took a deep breath and softened his tone. "You're right, I'm sorry. I need you to trust that I'm doing everything I can." "I do trust you," Ruth replied quietly. "But I also need you to trust me. Let's find a way to fix this together." Over time, they began to communicate better, working as a team instead of against each other. Ruth's practical approach complemented Victor's bold vision. They started analyzing their expenses more carefully, cutting unnecessary costs and renegotiating contracts with suppliers. Ruth reached out to local contacts for advice, while Victor focused on building relationships with potential clients. Slowly, things began to improve. One day, Victor came home with news that lifted their spirits. A client who had been hesitant to sign on finally agreed to a large order. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. That evening, they celebrated with a modest dinner at home. It wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with hope and laughter, something that had been missing for a long time. "I told you we'd make it," Victor said, raising his glass of water in a toast. "We're not there yet," Ruth replied with a smile, "but this is a good start." The days that followed were filled with cautious optimism. More clients began to express interest, and the business slowly gained momentum. Ruth noticed a change in Victor as well. He seemed more grounded, more willing to listen to her advice. They were no longer just surviving. They were building something together. Still, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a fine line. Success in business was unpredictable, and one wrong move could send them spiraling again. She kept her concerns to herself, focusing instead on supporting Victor and ensuring their operations remained stable. Victor, on the other hand, was finally beginning to see his dreams materialize. He envisioned expanding the business, hiring more staff, and perhaps even moving to a better neighborhood. The sacrifices they had made were finally paying off, and he was eager to push forward. But life, as they would soon learn, had a way of disrupting even the best laid plans. The foundation they were building, while promising, was far from secure. Neither of them could predict the storm that was quietly brewing on the horizon, a storm that would test their resilience and faith in one another like never before. The first signs of success came gradually, like the faint glow of dawn after a long, dark night. Victor secured one significant contract, and from there, other opportunities followed in quick succession. Word spread about their business, and more clients became interested in their products. Ruth worked tirelessly to maintain records, ensuring every order was processed efficiently and accurately. She knew that any misstep could ruin the fragile trust they had earned. Victor, energized by the momentum, became more ambitious. He began attending networking events and expanding their client base. The once overwhelming pressure of failure seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by an unshakable determination to grow the business. Ruth noticed a newfound lightness in him. He smiled more often, cracked jokes, and expressed more gratitude for her support. One weekend, Victor surprised Ruth with a small gesture that melted away some of the tension they had endured. He took her to a quiet park near their home, where they used to walk when things were simpler. They sat on a bench, enjoying the cool breeze as Victor spoke about their dreams in a way he hadn't in years. "Do you remember when we talked about owning our own home?" he asked, his eyes shining with hope. "How could I forget?" Ruth replied, smiling softly. "It felt impossible back then." "Not anymore. I think we're closer than ever." His optimism was infectious, and for the first time in a long while, Ruth allowed herself to believe that things might truly turn around. Yet deep down, a part of her remained cautious. She had learned to never fully trust success. It could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Business continued to improve over the next few months. They hired a few part-time employees to help with operations, allowing Victor and Ruth to focus on strategy and growth. Ruth took on the role of managing daily activities, keeping a close eye on the finances to ensure they stayed on track. She spent late nights balancing budgets, forecasting expenses, and preparing reports. Victor, meanwhile, poured himself into the expansion efforts. He traveled frequently, meeting with clients and investors in neighboring cities. Each time he returned, he brought promising news of more deals and partnerships. Their business was gaining recognition, and they finally began making plans to reinvest their profits. Despite the success, the couple remained grounded. They knew too many stories of people who had risen too quickly, only to fall just as fast. They agreed to build their future slowly and carefully. Ruth was particularly insistent on this point, urging Victor not to make hasty decisions that could jeopardize their progress. "Let's not get carried away," she warned one evening as they reviewed their latest financial statement. "We've come this far by being cautious. We should stay that way." Victor nodded, though his excitement was hard to contain. "I hear you, Ruth, but we also can't be afraid to take calculated risks. Playing it too safe might hold us back." "I just want us to be prepared for anything," she replied. "We've worked too hard to lose it all now." Victor promised to proceed carefully, though a part of him longed to take bigger leaps. The tension between their perspectives didn't lead to arguments, but it was always present. Ruth valued stability, while Victor thrived on ambition. Yet both knew they needed each other to succeed. As their business continued to flourish, Victor began talking about personal goals they had once put on hold. He spoke of buying a home, starting a family, and perhaps even traveling abroad, dreams that had seemed like distant fantasies not long ago. Ruth found herself dreaming too, albeit cautiously. She wanted all those things, but she also feared that success might slip through their fingers. In moments of solitude, Ruth would reflect on the journey that had brought them here. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, and the endless challenges had shaped them into stronger, more determined people. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking ahead. Life had taught her to never trust good fortune too easily. For now, though, she tried to savor the present. They were winning, and she wanted to believe that this was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Little did she know their greatest test was yet to come, a test that would push both her and Victor to their breaking points. Ruth woke up early as she always did, expecting to find Victor already at work or in the kitchen making coffee. The house, however, was eerily quiet. She called out his name but received no response. Frowning, she walked through each room, her steps quickening when she realized that his belongings were missing. His suitcase, laptop, and personal documents were gone. It was as though he had vanished in the middle of the night. At first, Ruth tried to stay calm. Maybe he had an early meeting out of town and forgot to mention it. Victor sometimes acted impulsively when business deals were urgent, but this was unusual. He would always at least leave her a note or send a message. She checked her phone repeatedly, expecting a call or text, but nothing came. As the hours passed, Ruth's worry deepened. She began calling everyone who might know his whereabouts, business partners, friends, Even Mike, the man who had introduced them to the business opportunity. No one had seen or heard from him. Mike sounded genuinely concerned and promised to reach out if he learned anything. By the end of the day, fear had gripped Ruth entirely. What if something had happened to Victor? What if he had been kidnapped or hurt? She considered going to the police but hesitated, knowing that without clear evidence of a crime, they might not take her seriously. Instead, she stayed up all night, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The man she loved, the man she had built her entire future with, was gone. The next morning, Ruth tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy by going to their office. However, when she arrived, she was met with more troubling news. Their bank accounts had been emptied. Every last dollar of their business profits was gone. Panic set in as she frantically contacted the bank, but they confirmed that the withdrawals had been authorized under Victor's name. Ruth was stunned, her mind refusing to process what she had just heard. It wasn't long before rumors began to spread. People who once praised Ruth and Victor's success whispered behind her back. Some speculated that Victor had run off with another woman, while others suggested that he had fled to avoid paying off business debts. Ruth became the subject of pity and ridicule, her reputation crumbling under the weight of gossip. Everywhere she went, she felt the eyes of judgment on her. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no word from Victor. Ruth cycled through a range of emotions: confusion, anger, heartbreak. How could he do this to her? They had built the business together, sacrificed so much to make it work. She replayed their last conversations in her mind, searching for signs that she might have missed. Had he been planning this all along? Had their entire relationship been a lie? Despite her emotional turmoil, Ruth knew she couldn't afford to collapse entirely. The business was in shambles, creditors were calling, and unpaid bills were piling up. She tried to salvage what she could, but without access to their funds or Victor's involvement, she was fighting a losing battle. Suppliers cut ties, and clients withdrew their contracts. Ruth was left with nothing but the wreckage of what had once been their dream. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the empty office, Ruth broke down completely. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of everything crashed down on her. She had believed in Victor, trusted him with her heart and their future. Now, that trust had been shattered in the most devastating way. Grace, her closest friend, visited her that evening after hearing about the situation. Ruth hesitated to open up, but eventually the pain became too much to bear in silence. As she recounted everything that had happened, Grace knit with a mixture of empathy and disbelief. "Ruth, you don't deserve this," Grace said softly. "Whatever Victor's reasons were, they don't justify what he's done to you. You have to find a way to move forward." "I don't even know where to start," Ruth whispered, her voice hollow. "He was my partner, my everything. How do I rebuild after this?" "You're stronger than you think," Grace replied firmly. "You've already survived so much. Start by taking care of yourself. And when you're ready, maybe you can start looking for answers." The idea of confronting the truth both terrified and intrigued Ruth. She knew that if she didn't face this head-on, the questions would haunt her forever. Victor's disappearance had left her broken, but deep within the pain, a spark of determination began to take hold. She wasn't ready to give up just yet. The time would come to seek the truth, and when it did, she would be prepared. The weeks after Victor's disappearance dragged on with an unbearable weight. Ruth found herself falling deeper into despair. The life they had built together seemed like a cruel joke now, a dream that had turned into a nightmare overnight. Every time she walked past the empty office or the barren shelves of their business, she was reminded of how quickly success could evaporate. Her mind raced with questions she could not answer. Where had Victor gone? Why had he left without an explanation? Ruth's nights were the worst. Sleep eluded her as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of happier times. She would hear Victor's voice in her dreams, only to wake up with a suffocating ache in her chest. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, began to wear her down. She barely ate and found herself unable to perform even the simplest tasks. Days blended into one another, each more difficult than the last. The pressure around her intensified. Creditors began to show up at her home demanding payment. Some were sympathetic, understanding that she had been left in an impossible situation, but others were ruthless. They accused her of being complicit in Victor's disappearance, insisting she must have known where the money had gone. The humiliation was unbearable. Everywhere she went, people whispered behind her back, casting judgment without knowing the full story. Ruth's closest friends, except for Grace, distanced themselves. They didn't want to be associated with someone whose business had collapsed so spectacularly. Ruth felt utterly alone, abandoned not only by Victor but by the world around her. She found herself turning to alcohol, seeking a numbness that could temporarily dull the pain. What started as an occasional drink soon became a nightly ritual. Each sip brought a brief respite, but it was always followed by a deeper sense of emptiness. One evening, after a particularly harsh confrontation with a creditor, Ruth broke down in the middle of her apartment. She clutched a bottle of wine as tears streamed down her face. "Why did you do this to me, Victor?" she whispered into the silence. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest like a crushing force. She wanted to scream, to tear apart everything around her, but there was no one to hear her pain. The downward spiral continued until Grace intervened. Grace had been worried about Ruth for weeks but had given her space to grieve. However, when she saw Ruth's deteriorating condition during a surprise visit, she knew she had to act. Grace found Ruth slumped on the couch, surrounded by empty bottles and crumpled bills. "Ruth, you can't keep doing this to yourself," Grace said, her voice firm but gentle. "This isn't going to bring Victor back or solve anything." Ruth shook her head, barely able to lift her gaze. "You don't understand. He left me with nothing. Nothing, Grace. I don't even know how to survive anymore." "I understand more than you think," Grace replied, sitting beside her. "But you have to survive. You can't let him destroy you like this. You're stronger than this, Ruth." Ruth didn't respond immediately. The idea of strength felt foreign to her now. But something in Grace's words sparked a tiny glimmer of hope, a reminder that perhaps she wasn't entirely broken. Grace helped her clean up and encouraged her to start small. The next day, Ruth forced herself to take a walk outside, the sunlight hurting her eyes after weeks spent in darkness. Over time, Ruth began rebuilding small pieces of her routine. She stopped drinking and focused on her health. Grace continued to support her, visiting often and offering encouragement. Ruth still felt the pain of Victor's betrayal, but she was learning to carry it without letting it consume her. She started thinking about the future again, though the idea of trusting anyone seemed impossible. One day Grace brought unexpected news. "I think I found something," she said, handing Ruth a folded piece of paper. "A contact of mine saw Victor in another city. He didn't look like someone living freely. He looked nervous, like he was hiding from something." Ruth's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, her heart pounding. For the first time in months, she felt a surge of determination. Victor had left her broken, but if he was still out there, she needed answers. She couldn't let this mystery define her life any longer. It was time to take control and find out the truth. Ruth sat in silence, staring at the paper Grace had given her. The information was vague, just a location and a few lines describing a man matching Victor's appearance, but it was more than she had hoped for. After months of torment, she finally had a lead. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. What would she do when she found him? Would she confront him with her anger or demand answers? What if he refused to explain himself? The fear of what lay ahead tugged at her resolve, but Ruth knew she had no choice. She had spent too long in the dark, drowning in uncertainty. Now she needed closure. That night, she packed a small bag and planned her trip, alerting no one but Grace. She didn't want anyone questioning her motives or trying to dissuade her. This journey was hers alone. The next morning, Ruth boarded a bus bound for the city where Victor was last seen. The ride was long and uncomfortable, giving her too much time to think. Every mile seemed to stretch her emotions tighter. She pictured Victor's face, first the man she had loved and trusted, then the one who had vanished without a trace. Was he still the person she had known, or had time and betrayal changed him into someone else entirely? When Ruth finally arrived, the city felt unfamiliar and overwhelming. She wandered through crowded streets, clutching the address Grace had provided. It led her to a modest neighborhood filled with narrow alleyways and aging apartment buildings. The sense of urgency weighed heavily on her as she approached a small complex that matched the description. Her hands trembled slightly as she climbed the stairs, unsure of what she would find on the other side of the door. Knocking softly at first, she waited. No response. She knocked again, louder this time. Footsteps shuffled behind the door, and then it opened just a crack. Ruth's breath caught in her throat as she saw him, Victor. His face was thinner, his eyes tired and shadowed, but there was no mistaking him. For a moment neither of them spoke. "Ruth?" Victor finally whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "Yes, it's me," she replied coldly, the months of pain rushing back in an instant. Surprised, Victor hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder before opening the door wider. "You shouldn't be here," he said urgently. "It's not safe." "Not safe," Ruth repeated, anger rising in her chest. "You disappear, take all our money, leave me to face ruin, and now you're worried about my safety." Victor sighed and gestured for her to come inside. Reluctantly, she stepped through the door. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with no signs of the wealth they had worked so hard to earn. Victor closed the door behind her and ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I can explain," he said quietly. "Explain?" Ruth's voice cracked with emotion. "You abandoned me, Victor. Do you have any idea what I've been through? The creditors, the humiliation, the isolation. You left me to deal with all of it alone." "I didn't have a choice," he replied, his voice strained. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought I could protect you, but everything got out of control." "Protect me from what?" Ruth demanded. "What could possibly justify what you did?" Victor hesitated, his gaze shifting as though debating how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed heavily. "It's Charles," he said, the name unfamiliar to Ruth. "He's dangerous. He threatened both of us, Ruth. If I hadn't done what he wanted, he would have destroyed everything and hurt you in the process." Ruth's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "And your solution was to run? To steal everything and leave me with nothing?" "I thought I was keeping you safe," Victor said desperately. "But I was wrong. I know that now." Ruth's mind swirled with conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, and a flicker of fear. She had never imagined that their downfall had been orchestrated by someone else. Could Victor be telling the truth? Or was this just another lie? "Who is Charles, and what does he want?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Victor sighed again, sitting down heavily on a worn-out chair. "He's a powerful businessman who wanted control of our venture. When I refused to cooperate, he came after us. I didn't see any other way out." For the first time, Ruth saw the fear in Victor's eyes, the same fear that had driven him into hiding. The answers she sought were more complicated than she had imagined. But one thing was certain. She couldn't let this man, whoever he was, continue to control their lives. It was time to uncover the full truth and reclaim what had been taken from her. Ruth sat across from Victor, her mind racing as she processed the information. Charles, a man she had never heard of, was apparently at the center of their destruction. The fear in Victor's eyes told her this was no simple business rivalry. Still, it was hard to reconcile the man in front of her with the one who had fled without a word. "I need more than vague answers, Victor," she said, her voice cold. "If you want me to believe you, tell me everything. Who is Charles, and how did he gain control over you?" Victor hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Charles is ruthless. He runs a large conglomerate, but his power isn't just about money. He has connections, people who can ruin you with a single phone call or make you disappear without a trace. When Mike introduced me to him, I thought he was just another investor looking for a share in the business." "What changed?" Ruth asked, narrowing her eyes. "He made demands," Victor continued. "He wanted controlling interest in the company. I refused. That's when the threats started. First, it was subtle delayed shipments, deals mysteriously falling through. Then it escalated. He sent men to warn me, and they made it clear that if I didn't hand over control, he'd destroy us." Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known business was risky, but this sounded like a criminal empire. Still, something didn't add up. "Why didn't you tell me? We could have fought this together." I wanted to, but I was scared, Victor admitted. He knew things about us, where we lived, who we trusted. I thought if I disappeared and gave him what he wanted, he'd leave you alone. I didn't think it would get this bad. Ruth stood and began pacing the small room. Part of her wanted to scream at him for his cowardice, for abandoning her without warning, but another part of her couldn't ignore the fear he had lived with. She understood now that Victor had acted out of desperation, not malice. Still, that didn't erase the consequences of his actions. "Do you know where he is now?" she asked after a long silence. Victor shook his head. "No, I've been hiding, trying to stay off his radar, but I've heard rumors. He's still expanding, using intimidation to take over smaller businesses." Ruth clenched her fists. "He took everything from us. He doesn't get to walk away unchallenged." Victor looked up at her, surprised by the fire in her voice. "Ruth, this isn't a fight you can win easily. Charles doesn't play fair. If you go after him, he'll come after you." "Let him," she said, her jaw set with determination. "I've already lost everything. I'm not afraid of him. But I need to know if you're with me or not." Victor hesitated, then slowly nodded. "I owe you that much. I'll help you however I can. But we need to be smart. This isn't just about revenge. We need to gather evidence, allies. We can't take him down alone." Together they began formulating a plan. Ruth suggested reaching out to Grace, whose connections might provide valuable information. Victor agreed, mentioning a few former business associates who had also been targeted by Charles. It was time to gather their strength and fight back. The following days were a whirlwind of cautious meetings and quiet investigations. Grace didn't hesitate to help, introducing them to a lawyer who specialized in corporate sabotage cases. The lawyer warned them of the dangers, but agreed to look into Charles's operations. Meanwhile, Victor contacted a former supplier who had also been bullied into submission. The supplier, eager to see Charles exposed, provided documents detailing the man's illegal activities. Ruth felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent months drowning in despair, but now she was taking back control. Every small victory fueled her resolve. Still, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. They were up against a man with far-reaching power, and one wrong move could cost them everything. One night, as they reviewed their findings, Victor spoke softly. "I'm sorry for everything, Ruth. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'll make it right. I swear." She glanced at him, her expression softening for the first time in months. "We'll make it right together. But don't think I've forgiven you just yet." He nodded, accepting her words without protest. Trust would take time to rebuild, but for now they had a common enemy and a chance to reclaim their lives. The tension thickened as Ruth and Victor continued gathering evidence against Charles. Every lead they uncovered revealed a deeper web of corruption and fear. Business owners, lawyers, and former employees of Charles's empire all spoke of intimidation tactics, mysterious disappearances, and ruined livelihoods. The man was far more dangerous than either of them had initially imagined. It wasn't just about taking over businesses. Charles wielded his influence like a weapon, crushing anyone who dared defy him. Ruth felt both anger and fear growing within her. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about standing up to someone who had destroyed countless lives. Despite her resolve, the enormity of the task ahead weighed heavily on her. Could they really bring down a man with such power? Their first challenge came when one of their key witnesses backed out. Ruth and Victor had arranged to meet a supplier who had agreed to testify about Charles's illegal dealings. However, when they arrived at the meeting point, the man was nowhere to be found. Hours later, Victor received a text message from the witness stating that he couldn't risk his family's safety and had changed his mind. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Victor muttered, pacing the room anxiously. "Charles gets to people. He knows how to make them afraid." Ruth, though frustrated, refused to be discouraged. "Then we'll find someone else," she said firmly. "There has to be someone willing to stand up to him. We can't give up just because he's using fear to control people." Victor looked at her with a mixture of admiration and guilt. "You've become stronger through all of this," he said quietly. "I had no choice," Ruth replied. "You left me with nothing. I had to find my strength." They continued their search, eventually finding a former accountant who had once worked for one of Charles's subsidiary companies. The accountant, a nervous man named Jacob, agreed to meet in secret. He provided documents showing how Charles had funneled money through shell companies and bribed officials to protect his operations. "This is dangerous," Jacob warned as he handed over the files. "Charles doesn't leave loose ends. If he finds out I helped you, I'll have to disappear." "We'll protect you," Ruth promised, though she knew how hollow her words must have sounded. She hated the feeling of dragging others into danger, but there was no other way to bring Charles down. They needed evidence and witnesses to build a case strong enough to withstand his influence. The documents Jacob provided were a turning point. Grace's lawyer contact confirmed that they could pursue legal action based on the information. However, they would need to keep their next moves hidden from Charles for as long as possible. If he caught wind of their plans, he could easily obstruct the case. Ruth and Victor adopted new measures to protect themselves. They changed phone numbers, limited their movements, and communicated only through encrypted channels. Grace continued to be a crucial ally, helping them stay one step ahead. Despite the precautions, Ruth felt a constant sense of paranoia. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her fears were validated when one evening Victor spotted a suspicious car parked near his apartment. The driver lingered for hours, making no attempt to conceal his surveillance. Victor notified Ruth, who immediately contacted the lawyer and the police. Though the car eventually drove off, the message was clear. Charles was aware of their activities and wasn't going to let them proceed without interference. "We can't back down now," Ruth told Victor after the incident. "He's trying to scare us, just like he's done to everyone else. But we're not going to run." Victor nodded, his jaw tightening. "You're right. He's already taken too much from us. It's time to fight back." Their next move was to file an anonymous report with a government anti-corruption agency. The hope was that the agency's resources could protect the investigation from being sabotaged. At the same time, they quietly worked with a journalist Grace knew, someone with a reputation for exposing powerful figures. The journalist, intrigued by the story, agreed to publish an expose if the case advanced. However, time was running out. Charles's network of spies and enforcers was vast, and Ruth knew that every step they took brought them closer to danger. Despite the risks, she felt more determined than ever. This was no longer just about reclaiming what had been stolen. It was about justice for everyone Charles had hurt. "We're going to finish this," Ruth said one night as they reviewed their progress. "No matter what it takes." Victor met her gaze, his voice steady. Together. The storm was coming, and they would face it head-on. The storm Ruth had anticipated came faster and fiercer than she could have imagined. Within days of filing the anonymous report and handing evidence to the journalist, Charles's retaliation began. Several of the witnesses they had spoken to disappeared. Their phones were disconnected, and their homes were abandoned. Ruth's anxiety grew as she realized just how vast his influence truly was. It was a sobering reminder that they were up against a man who had built an empire on fear. Victor insisted on heightened security measures. They switched accommodations frequently, staying in different safe houses that Grace helped arrange. Victor's instincts had sharpened since going into hiding. He watched every shadow, every unfamiliar face in a crowd. His paranoia, while exhausting, proved useful. On more than one occasion, he noticed men trailing them and led Ruth away before they could be cornered. Despite these precautions, Ruth refused to be silenced. The journalist, Daniel, contacted her with updates. His investigation revealed other victims who had suffered at Charles's hands, former business owners, whistleblowers, and even government officials who had been forced out of power. With each new revelation, the scope of Charles's control became clearer. Daniel assured her that his team was preparing a major story that would expose everything. "You've started a movement, Ruth," Daniel said during a late-night phone call. "People who were too scared to speak out are finding their courage. You've given them hope." The words touched Ruth, but they also filled her with a heavy sense of responsibility. She knew how much was riding on their efforts, and she couldn't afford to fail now. Still, the pressure weighed on her. She barely slept, haunted by thoughts of what Charles might do next. Each time the phone rang or a car drove by too slowly, her heart raced. One night, as she sat with Victor in a dimly lit apartment, her exhaustion caught up with her. "What if we're not enough?" she whispered. "What if he's too powerful?" Victor leaned forward, his expression grim but resolute. "We've already come this far. We can't stop now. I won't let him win." For the first time in a long while, Ruth allowed herself to lean on Victor. His support, though complicated by their history, steadied her. They were in this together, bound by shared trauma and a need for justice. The next day their fears came to a head. While meeting with their lawyer, Ruth received a chilling call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm and menacing. "You're making a mistake, Ruth," the voice said. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Walk away now or you won't like the consequences." Ruth's hands trembled, but she forced herself to respond. "You think you can scare me? You've already taken everything from me. I have nothing left to lose." The line went dead. Ruth sat in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. Victor, who had overheard the conversation, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's scared," he said. "If he's resorting to direct threats, it means we're getting to him." It was a turning point for Ruth. The fear that had gripped her for so long began to fade, replaced by a fierce determination. Charles could no longer control her through intimidation. She knew now that he was not invincible. In the days that followed, events moved rapidly. The Anti-Corruption Agency launched a formal investigation, and Daniel's article was published, creating a media firestorm. Charles's name was splashed across headlines, his business dealings exposed for the world to see. Protests erupted outside his offices, with victims and activists demanding justice. Charles retaliated by attempting to discredit Ruth and Victor. False accusations appeared in tabloids, claiming they had fabricated the evidence for personal gain. However, the momentum was too strong to be stopped. More witnesses came forward, corroborating their story. The final blow came when law enforcement raided several of Charles's properties, uncovering incriminating documents. His closest associates, eager to save themselves, turned against him, providing even more evidence of his crimes. Charles was arrested in a dramatic public spectacle, his once imposing figure reduced to a man facing the collapse of his empire. As Ruth watched the news coverage, she felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. It was over after months of fear and struggle. They had finally won. Victor stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "We did it," he said softly. "We did," Ruth agreed, though the victory felt bittersweet. Their lives had been forever changed by what they had endured. But for the first time in months she felt a glimmer of peace. They had faced the storm and survived. Now it was time to rebuild. The courtroom was silent as the judge read out the charges against Charles. The atmosphere was tense, filled with reporters, lawyers, and victims who had come to witness the fall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Ruth sat in the front row, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. Victor was beside her, his posture stiff but resolute. It had taken months of fear, sacrifice, and hard work to get here, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. As Charles was escorted in, shackled and defiant, Ruth felt an odd sense of detachment. She had spent so long imagining this moment, wondering how it would feel to see the man responsible for their suffering face justice. Yet, now that it was happening, she felt neither triumph nor rage. Instead, there was a quiet, weary acceptance. This chapter of her life was finally nearing its end. The prosecution laid out their case with precision. Witness after witness testified, recounting how Charles had used threats, extortion, and violence to maintain control over his empire. Documents were presented, detailing illegal transactions and hidden accounts. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the image of power Charles had carefully crafted over the years. Ruth watched as his confidence faltered, his mask of arrogance slipping with every damning revelation. When it was Ruth's turn to testify, she rose slowly, her heart pounding. She had prepared for this moment, but the weight of it still pressed heavily on her. Standing before the court, she took a deep breath and met the judge's gaze. "My name is Ruth," she began, her voice steady. "For years I believed in hard work, trust, and partnership. My husband and I built a business from nothing, only to have it taken from us through manipulation and fear. Charles used his power to destroy not just our business, but our lives. We were left with nothing, forced to live in fear, to watch everything we had worked for crumble. Today I'm here to speak not just for myself, but for everyone he hurt. We deserve justice. Her testimony was powerful, drawing nods of empathy from many in the room. When she finished, she returned to her seat, feeling both drained and empowered. The truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. As the trial continued, Ruth found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the countless sleepless nights, the moments of despair when she had wanted to give up. She thought of Grace's unwavering support, Daniel's fearless reporting, and the courage of those who had come forward despite the risks. Most of all, she thought of the person she had become, a woman who had learned to stand in her own strength, to fight back against those who sought to break her. Victor had changed as well. The guilt that had once consumed him was slowly giving way to purpose. He had fought alongside her, not only to make amends but to reclaim the integrity he had lost. Ruth saw it in the way he carried himself now, in the quiet resolve that replaced his earlier fear. The final day of the trial came swiftly. The judge, after reviewing all the evidence, delivered a resounding verdict, guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and intimidation. Charles's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to decades in prison, his empire dismantled and his reputation shattered. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause from those who had suffered under his reign. Reporters rushed to capture the reactions, but Ruth paid them no mind. She sat still, letting the moment wash over her. It was done. The weight she had carried for so long began to lift, leaving space for something new, peace. Outside the courthouse, Grace was waiting for them. She hugged Ruth tightly, smiling with pride. "You did it," she whispered. "You finally got justice." "It wasn't just me," Ruth replied. "It was all of us. I couldn't have done it without you." Victor stood beside them, his expression softer than Ruth had seen in months. "We have a long road ahead," he said quietly, "but at least now we can walk it without fear." Together they left the courthouse, the bright sunlight warming their faces. The city seemed different now, full of possibility rather than shadows. Ruth knew the scars of the past would never fully fade, but they no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her life, and for the first time in a long while she felt free. As they walked away, Ruth allowed herself a small smile. The storm had passed, and with it came the promise of a new beginning. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.